What are you afraid of? Before starting your D&D Halloween adventure, each player will choose a phobia for their character. And it might even be something that scares you. Nothing that you're not comfortable role-playing with, though using a real phobia may enhance this adventure and possibly take you outside your comfort zone. But creating a fear for your D&D character that you get to role-play instead might make the adventure more fun. You get to explore fear through your character's eyes. You could choose something tangible like a fear of spiders or the dark, or something intangible like a fear of powerlessness. Your phobia could also be tied to your character's history. Perhaps a former mentor left you trapped in the bottom of a well for disobedience or failure, which instilled in you a phobia of damp, tight spaces. The GM is going to collect these phobias and pocket them for later. Each one will come up during the adventure, giving each character an opportunity for the spotlight. My name is Ben Byrne, and this is your Halloween D&D adventure. Your adventure begins in a small village named Wiltshire, located on a road to somewhere far more important. Wiltshire is a town swathed in paranoia and fear. Folk aren't particularly friendly to outsiders and don't always speak well of each other either. The village is strangely empty. There are far more houses here than people, and the locals all give different answers when asked the question, "Where is everyone?" Nobody can seem to remember a single name of anyone who's left the village. Though the tavern has only been abandoned for what appears to be maybe a month, no one can recall who the proprietor was or why they left. The blacksmith tells you the story that the soil surrounding Wiltshire is fouled and crops rot in the earth. So farmers have simply packed up their bags and moved to greener pastures. Greta, the local priestess, meanwhile, is convinced that a hag has bewitched the village and lives secretly among the commoners. She offers you gold to discover this hag's identity. In fact, several commoners come to you with mysterious and macabre requests. A stable boy named Heinrich confides in you that he's been mauled by a werewolf and begs you to slay him, or help to confine him during the approaching full moon. A father named Amon believes his recently deceased children are still alive and has seen them in the village. Most claim he's delusional with grief, and Greta believes Amon is hexed. Amon asks you to escort him to the cemetery in the secrecy of night so that he can exhume his children's bodies and prove to himself that he hasn't lost his mind. Something is clearly amiss in Wiltshire with all these strange occurrences happening at once. Your party may have just been passing through the village, or maybe your character is returning home after years abroad. Or perhaps you came to this strange village to hide, discovering more than you bargained for. This adventure mixes inspirations to create a sort of grim hollow version of the False Hydra and Stephen King's It. The monster plaguing Wiltshire is an archdemon named Beleth. In grim hollow mythology, Beleth is the deity of fear. However, Beleth finds mortals atrociously funny, and Wiltshire is Beleth's playground. The morbid experiences of the folk living in Wiltshire are their worst fears manifested. Beleth cackles at the villagers' inane actions as they try to face or escape their fears. Heinrich is paranoid that others view him as disgusting or monstrous, so is deluded into believing that he has been bitten by a lycanthrope. If you agree to guard Heinrich during the full moon, he contorts and screams, but he never actually transforms. If you escort Amon to the cemetery to exhume his children, their grey cadavers never rise from their coffins. They remain limp in his arms as he weeps over them. Amon was a good father, but he fears even in death he can't protect his children. Beleth laughs as Amon's delusions drive him to desecrate their graves himself. And the priestess Greta is terrified of apostate mages. If you accept her quest to hunt Wiltshire's hag, there are many villagers that you can bring before her for trial. Perhaps a villager can't explain why there's alchemist supplies in their house, which belonged to their deceased spouse who was consumed by Beleth already. Any mortal Beleth tires of and finally eats is erased from everyone else's memory. The alchemist's supplies may be the only evidence Priestess Greta needs to execute the commoner as a witch, but she never finds the hag no matter who she prosecutes. And the archdemon cackles in glee as Wiltshire's spiritual protector becomes its persecutor. But the real twist of this adventure is that anyone who spends time in Wiltshire comes under Beleth's sway, including your party of adventurers. What phobias did you choose for your character before you began playing? If you're the GM, how can you twist these phobias to become encounters in the village? Is the party attacked by a swarm of giant spiders in the abandoned tavern, or a crawling grave in the cemetery that tries to bury you alive among the corpses? Is one character's phobia loneliness and abandonment, and during an encounter, they can't see or interact with any other party members standing around them? Be creative with how you utilize these phobias as the GM, and if you like running horror D&D adventures, then prepare yourself for Grim Halloween. The Grim Hollow Kickstarter is in its final days leading up to Halloween, and if it's still October when you're watching this, there's still time for you to back and help celebrate the spooky season. If you don't already know, Grim Hollow is 5e's greatest dark fantasy setting, and we're revamping both the campaign guide and the player's guide for D&D 2024. For GMs, we provide new rules to help 5e feel more grounded and spooky, such as complex curses that can't be lifted by a mere spell and grievous wounds with longer rest mechanics. For players, we have 40 horror-themed subclasses, gothic species, macabre magic items, and rules for transforming into a monster yourself, like a vampire or a werewolf. You can also include one of your favorite VTTs with your pledge, or get these books available on D&D Beyond when they fulfill by clicking that link there and celebrating Grim Halloween. During your investigations in Wiltshire, you're eventually going to be led to that one haunted house in the village. You know, the one place everybody knows not to go inside of. But Heinrich believes it's the only place he can safely transform whilst isolated. Amon can hear the voices of his two children coming from inside, begging him for help. And Greta eventually concludes it must be where the hag is hiding, but in truth, this haunted house leads to Beleth's lair deep beneath Wiltshire. The archdemon lures its victims there to finally be consumed, and your characters are not immune. Use their phobias to lure your party into the house as well. Maybe your phobia is losing a loved one who you followed to Wiltshire, and another villager tells you that loved one was last seen entering inside that house before they disappeared. Or maybe your phobia is a guilty conscience for those you've murdered, and the more time spent in Wiltshire, you start to hear their heartbeats from inside the house. Or perhaps you discover your old mentor who trapped you at the bottom of a well as a child is now living in that house, daring you to confront them. Each character may have their own delusion about what the house represents, but not every character has to have one. This quest will work better if the players believe the reason they're investigating the house at first is true, but once they get inside, things become strange. Run the house like it's a modest dungeon crawl that extends deep beneath the village, but use every phobia your players gave you to construct this dungeon. If anybody chose drowning as their phobia, make sections of the dungeon entirely submerged. Whilst traversing these passages, grasping reeds threaten to grapple characters and keep them beneath the surface of the water. If somebody chose darkness as their phobia, magical light doesn't function anywhere in the dungeon and lanterns flicker. And the dungeon just gets more surreal as the party progresses. If gore was chosen as a phobia, the walls twist into the shape of mutilated limbs that grasp at passers-by. Maybe no healing works in this dungeon if powerlessness was chosen as a phobia to ratchet up the tension. This is a place where the mortal realm begins to bleed into the netherworld, the realm of demons. If you want to truly capture a tense atmosphere, dim the house lights and use only candles, like we suggested in this earlier video about why it's fun being scared. Belith sits in a grim dining hall with a fully set table at the bottom of the dungeon. Between his tittering giggles as he watches the mortals above, he munches on flesh and blood and bone. He sits at the head of the table, his oily black eyes watching you enter. Those dark pits glisten with a menacing glee. The table before the demon is served with the torn limbs and pulpous offal strewn across the silverware. Pale faces are contorted in sightless terror from dinner plates. Belith may greet your characters with delight if the characters were lured into the carnal house by their own phobias. He enjoys torturing brave adventurers most of all. Or Belith may be displeased if your party rescued another villager from their phobia. Did you prove to Heinrich that he couldn't possibly be a werewolf? Or convince Greta that no hags live in the village? Was Amon comforted in their grief in the cemetery? In any case, Belith attacks the party intent on adding their flesh to his dining table. But this is an archdemon you are fighting and not any common monster. Belith manifests tangible illusions into the minds of the characters that reflect each of their phobias. And this functions similarly to the Phantasmal Force spell. Each illusion can be perceived by all characters, but whilst an illusion is active, the character whose phobia it represents has the frightened condition. These illusions can also absolutely harm the characters. One illusion could be a terrifying monster to fight, such as a giant spider or an old mentor coming back to seek revenge. The walls of this chamber might crack and water begins pouring in if your fear is drowning. Or the damage of your spells might be halved if your fear is powerlessness. Ideally, this encounter utilizes a mix of physical, environmental, and emotional threats inspired by the player character's phobias to create a really unique and difficult encounter. Belith cannot be attacked directly. He simply disappears among the illusions, cackling audibly. Or he shrugs off any damage aimed at him. Because the archdemon of fear can only be conquered when you defeat fear itself. During the encounter, each character can make a study action against the illusion that's inspired by their personal phobia. The DC for the intelligence check is 21. A character might use nature to notice the water pouring into the room isn't real, or an arcana check to realize their magic is as powerful as it's ever been. Succeeding this check banishes the illusion that represents your fear, causing you to lose the frightened condition, and reducing illusionary monsters to 0 hit points also banishes them if they're your fear. Once all illusions have been banished, that represents the characters overcoming their fears collectively, and robbed of his power, Belith furiously retreats back into the netherworld. At least for the next 27 years. How difficult you want to make this final encounter depends on what tone you want your adventure to end on. A more heroic tale could lower the DC for characters overcoming their fears. But if you want your Halloween adventure to be especially spooky, you should check out this video with more general tips for running a horror D&D adventure. And if you want to run Dark Fantasy 5e games, you should check out our Grim Hollow Kickstarter by clicking this link here. There's only a few more days left to back, so take a look before Grim Halloween is over.